It's good to see you all this morning. Appreciate the presence of everyone. Count yourself a visitor. We want to know that you're extremely welcome here. And I hope the things that we are going to study together this morning is beneficial to everyone present today. If you remember the last time I was up, we talked about what God intended for the promised land. Well, that was 5 weeks and 2 major holidays ago, but when we got home that Sunday morning, Judy suggested that I do a part 2 of that study. So here we are. We're going to do a part 2 of a study of the promised land. Again, last time we talked about what God intended the promised land to be, and the backbone of that study, and I guess now the series, was the first 6 books of the Bible, just about the first 5.5 books of the Bible, build up and lead up to the children of Israel taking possession of Canaan land. Right? God promises it to Abraham, and then the next 5 books, you anticipate as you're reading them fulfilling that promise. Multiple times it is referred to a land of plenty, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of rest. But when we get to the book of Judges, we read and we realize that it didn't turn out that way. And in fact, to be quite frank about it, everything went horribly wrong once the children of Israel settled in the promised land. Now, before we dig into part 2 this morning, I want to touch on a point from our last study that I don't feel like I spent enough time talking about, and I just want to elaborate on it real quick. We're going to spend just a couple of minutes on it here. Last time we talked about how the children of Israel, what God intended for the promised land, was for them to be an example of holiness before all the other nations. They were supposed to be a holy people, a sacred people of God's own possession. And they were supposed to exemplify righteous living amongst all their neighbors. And so we talked about how they were supposed to be a good example. But I want to elaborate just real quickly this morning on how different they were supposed to be compared to all the pagan nations that surrounded them. They were truly supposed to be a peculiar people, set apart from their neighbors. The Bible talks about specifically in Deuteronomy about how different they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be helpful to their neighbors and even the strangers who journeyed through their land. We talked a little bit about how different that was compared to the Amorites and the Amalekites and the other Canaanites in the area. The Bible talks about, or God tells them that they needed to be devoted to honesty and justice, specifically in their business dealings, and what a difference that would have been back in ancient times in that area. They were supposed to dress differently. God gets very intricate in his details about how different they were supposed to be. They were supposed to dress differently than their counterparts, than the neighboring nations. They were supposed to eat differently than their neighbors. Their treatment of animals was supposed to be different, with respect. Their treatment of trees, if there are any fellow environmentalists out here, their treatment of trees were supposed to be different. Again, very minute details about how different they were supposed to behave. Their building construction was supposed to be different. God tells them that they're supposed to have parapet walls on their roofs, and seemingly the purpose is to prevent small children from falling off and injuring themselves or die. Again, the children of Israel in the promised land, had they obeyed God's commandments, would have set them apart. God intended for them, He intended for the promised land to be different, to be set apart from all the other nations. That's the end of part 1, and it serves as, I think, a good springboard for our study this morning. Of course, our first point of application is we too, as the church, are supposed to be different from our counterparts. The Bible calls us a peculiar people in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. More about that perhaps in another study. So we talked about last time what the promised land was intended to be. Today, I want to talk about why it didn't turn out how it was supposed to be. That's our question this morning. How did they fail in the promised land? Compare for a moment, as we set this study up this morning, the verses that we find in Joshua chapter 24 and Judges chapter 2. Now, Joshua chapter 24, pardon my graph, no lesson is complete without a graph. Joshua chapter 24 takes place at the end of the conquest, right? So we've gone through the Exodus under Moses. We've gone through the years of the conquest under Joshua. Really, our timeline of study is of the settlement after Joshua's death. Now, Joshua 24 takes place right at the end of the conquest. He's about to die. You remember chapter 24, verse 15. He says, "As for me and my house, who will you serve? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so the children of Israel answer him, and they say in verses 16 through 18, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord and serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt. The Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites who lived in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." So if we were to rate or give them a score on a scale of 1 to 10, their faith at the end of the conquest here, it would probably be pretty high. It said, we too are going to serve the Lord. Joshua 24. Now flip over a couple of pages, Judges chapter 2. This is 2 chapters later. And the Bible says that it's somewhere around 1 to 2 generations later. Not much time has passed between these 2 chapters. Judges 2, 11 through 13. The sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. The difference there. We will serve the Lord. They serve the Baals. We will not forsake our God who brought us out from the land of Egypt. Verse 12. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord. We will also serve the Lord. We will not forsake him. So they forsook the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So our question for our study this morning, how did we go from we will serve the Lord and 2 chapters later, we forsook the Lord? How did we go from here to here? That's the question. How did they fail in the promised land? How did it all start? What went wrong? The answer to that question is really pretty simple. And so I thought it might be an engaging and maybe a little fun way to present this information like this. God gave the children of Israel very specific assignments in their dealings with the Canaanites. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to read each assignment. We're going to go through 4 of them. There are more, but we've whittled it down to 4. We're going to read each assignment, and then we're going to see how they did, and we're going to fill out the report card. We're going to give them a grade, pass, fail, on each assignment. If you ever wanted to be the teacher and you give the grades, now's your chance. Let's roll through it and see how they did. Assignment number 1, drive out the Canaanites. All right? Assignment number 1, homework problem number 1, drive out the Canaanites. Numbers 33, 51 through 52, 55 through 56. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as barbs in your eyes and as thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. So a couple of points from this passage here. Number 1, notice that his instruction to the children of Israel is all the inhabitants. They were to drive out all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. And notice again, secondly, the stern warning that he gives to them in the end here about letting some of them remain. Drive them all out, And if you let them remain, they're going to become thorns in your sides and barbs in your eyes. All right, assignment number 1, drive them out. Let's see how they did. Now, when Israel entered the promised land in the time of the conquest under Joshua, for the most part, they did a pretty good job of sticking to this assignment. In fact, in Joshua chapter 12, the Bible lists for us 31 kings and associated provinces or cities that the children of Israel debased during the conquest. 31. Not too shabby. But now again, our focus is in the time of the settlement. There are several pockets of resistance. There are several Canaanite cities still left. Joshua's dead. Let's see how they do. Judges chapter 1. Here's a selection of verses from Judges 1. Verse 21. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And he's broken this up by tribe here. But Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean and its villages, or Taanach and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in the land. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who were living in, and pardon my pronunciation on all these, drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. It's probably not how that's pronounced. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or of Ahalab or of Akzib or of Helba or of Aphek or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Bethshemesh and Beth Anath became forced labor for them. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down into the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres and in Ajalon and in Shalbim. Now, I know that was a lengthy reading, but by my count, that was 22 cities or areas that the children of Israel did not dispossess the Canaanites. So, the assignment was to drive them out. What grade would you give them? And don't forget, the assignment was to drive them all out. They were not to leave any of them within the promised land. I think obviously we have to fail them on assignment number 1. All right. 0 for 1. Let's move on. Assignment number 2, we actually just read the answer to, but assignment number 2 is no forced labor agreements. God did not want them to strike any forced labor agreements with the Canaanites. Now, a forced labor agreement was simply if they conquered a people, they were not to be long-term prisoners of war, we might say. They were not supposed to become slave labor for them. Okay? They were supposed to drive them out, as we saw in assignment number 1. Deuteronomy 20, verses 15 through 18 is where we find the verses for this assignment. Verse 15. Now in verse 11, he talks about they could strike forced labor agreements with peoples of cities far away. So not in the promised land, but far away. If they made a peace agreement, they could become forced labor. Listen to verse 15. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. Forced labor agreements, fine, far away. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. All right, so here in the promised land, you shall not, listen to this, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. Pretty harsh. Sounds a little over the top. Verse 17, but you shall utterly destroy them. The Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. Now, I want to press the pause button on this assignment real quick, and let's look at something. Why did God want to drive out the Canaanites? But in that verse, he said, don't leave anything alive that breathes. That's crazy. That's over the top, almost. It sounds like. But that's what he said. He said, utterly destroy. That's men, women, and children. Don't leave anything alive that breathes. That's cattle. That's dogs and cats. And utterly destroy, typically in the Bible, meant they burned the city and then poured salt everywhere so nothing would regrow. They burned the crops too. Notice the seriousness of the command here. Why did he want them out? Why did he tell them to kill them all? Well, the answer to that question is found in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4. It is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. Now, if you would like a list of the sinful, in that verse we read a moment ago, the detestable things that they were doing, look at Leviticus, the 18th chapter. We're not going to read it. It's 30 verses long. Here's a quick summary. Here's a summary of the things that the Canaanites were doing. Incestuous sexual relationships. There are 12 verses in Leviticus 18 about the people incest, adultery. And that's the least worst of all these. Homosexuality, bestiality. All of these in the sexual realm. Deuteronomy 12, verse 31. You remember, perhaps in our last study, about the emphasis that God places on children, on how the children of Israel were to teach their children. And it is apparent that God cared for children. He talks about treating orphans. Yet the people of Canaan, Deuteronomy 12:31, were offering their children as sacrifices to their gods. That verse in particular says they were burning them with fire. You imagine that. Taking one of your babies and burning it in fire as a sacrifice to a god. This is the wickedness going on in Canaan. And it's not far from what we're surrounded by today. I'm already starting to think about my third lesson in this series, Lord willing. And in some preliminary research of that lesson, I looked into how far are we? How far are we from this in 21st century America? And I know this is heavy, and I told Judy I wasn't going to say it, but I'm going to say it. In preliminary research, I stumbled across an article from 2019 that said of the top 10 most popular adult movie categories, incest is in the top 10. If you think we're far from this, think again. Teen was number one. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but our little girls are under attack. If you think we're far from this, we're not. And think about what the command was. You get them out from among you. That was the command. Now, let's see how they did. I know that's heavy. Let's leave that alone for now. Back to Judges 1. It came about when Israel became strong. Let's go back. He told them no forced labor agreements. All right, they were not supposed to remain among them. Came about when Israel became strong. They put the Canaanites to forced labor. They did not drive them out completely. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal So the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath. Inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anath became forced labor for them. Amorites persisted living in Mount Heres, in Ajalon and Shalbim, but when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. Okay. Assignment number 2. No forced labor agreements. Forced labor, forced labor, forced labor, forced labor. How did they do? They failed. Thirdly and fourthly, let's knock these two out at the same time. Deuteronomy 7, God told the Israelites no covenants, no compacts, no agreements, no intermarriages with the Canaanites. When the Lord your God, this is Deuteronomy 7, verses 2, 3, and 4. The Lord your God delivers them before you, and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. All right? Assignment number 3, no covenants. No agreements with them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. Now, our first encounter with these assignments, or the third one at least, we actually read about in Joshua the 9th chapter in the conquest. I'm not going to read Joshua 9, we'll just paraphrase our way through this. In Joshua 9, the Bible tells us that the sons of Israel came, or the people of the city of Gibeon, which is about 9 miles west of Jerusalem, right smack in the middle of the promised land, come to Joshua and the elders, and they lie to them. They deceive them. They tell them, we're not from here. We're from far away. Please don't kill us. Make a covenant with us. And Joshua and the elders, they take the bait. And there in verse 14, the Bible or the text makes a point to mention the men of Israel took some of their provisions. They did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. So they didn't ask God. Are they telling the truth? So they took the bait. Verse 15, and Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them. Okay. Man was no covenants. And here already in the conquest, we have a covenant. One more verse I want to look at. Verse 17. Now their cities, this is the Gibeonites, were Gibeon, and Chephirah, and Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. That's 4 more cities to add to the list of Canaanites that were left intact in the Promised Land. All right, that's a grand total, by my count, 26 cities we read about that they left intact. All right, God told them not to make covenants. If you want further proof, look at Judges, the 2nd chapter, verse 2. God says, you've made covenants with the people of Canaan. All right, no covenants. What's the grade? They failed. You made a covenant with the Gibeonites. Judges 2 and 2 seems to imply there are other covenants made. Did they get any of these right? Let's look at the last one. No intermarriages. Here's the answer. Judges 3, verses 5 through 6. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They weren't supposed to do that. And they took their daughters for themselves as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. God said no intermarriages. And what do? They mingled. They intermarried with the people of Canaan. 0 for 4. Real quickly this morning, how serious was God about these commandments? Right? 4 assignments. Was there any leeway there? Listen to Deuteronomy 13. Decide for yourself. If your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods. Now remember, they were supposed to drive the Canaanites out, and the whole point was God did not want the Canaanites to lead them into idolatry. And so here in Deuteronomy 13, the Bible says, if one of your number, if your son or your daughter, if the wife whom you love, entice you secretly and say, hey, let's go after these other gods, You shall not yield to him or listen to him, and your eye shall not pity him. You shall not spare or conceal him. You're supposed to tell people about it. You shall surely kill him. And not just kill him. Your hand will be first against him to put him to death. If Judy came to me and said, hey, let's go after some of these idols that our neighbors are worshiping, I was supposed to put her out, tell the city, and I was supposed to throw the first stone. If one of my daughters did the same thing, I was supposed to do the same thing. You imagine how heavy that stone would have been. That's how serious God was about these commandments. You kill your wife, you kill your daughter if they try to entice you into idolatry. Deuteronomy, or continuing, if a city, we'll just paraphrase our way through this, if a city gives itself to idolatry among you, burn the city to the ground. Pile everything up, burn it, and it's never to be rebuilt. That's how serious. You look at these assignments, you think, is there some leeway? Was he serious? It's just a homework. It only counts for 10% of the grade. No. So serious. And so the big question this morning is this. Why were these assignments important to God? Why were they important? Well, these assignments are repeated multiple times. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. They're repeated over and over again. The one said, don't leave anything alive that breathes. Are you kidding me? Why was this so important to God? When you place these verses side by side, these assignments, common theme develops. Numbers 33. They will trouble you in the land in which you live. Deuteronomy 20. So that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods. Deuteronomy 7. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Clearly, the answer is God wanted to prevent and eliminate bad influences from remaining in the promised land. God wanted to prevent bad influences from remaining in the promised land. And ultimately, our question for the study this morning, how did they fail in the promised land? What went wrong? This is the answer. They did not prevent bad influences from remaining in the promised land. And over time, as you read through the book of Judges, one generation to another, you see how these bad influences, let's go to the map. Again, 26 areas. And I've amplified these black circles just so you can see it. It's small compared to the overall landmass of the promised land. But the point is this. Bad influences, when left unchecked, what do? They grow. Over time, from one generation to the next generation, they grow and they amplify. And now you may think, how bad could it get? Right? The Canaanites, they were practicing incest, bestiality, homosexuality. They were killing their children, burning them in fire. How bad could it get? The answer is in Psalms chapter 106, where David recounts how bad it got for the children of Israel. Before you get to Psalm 106, read the last 5 chapters of Judges, and you'll see how bad it gets. It's Sodom and Gomorrah level wickedness performed by the children of Israel. Psalm 106, this is a retelling of what they did. They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and learned their practices, and served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and daughters to the demons. That's how bad it got. You think, Couple of cities, what's the big deal? Look at how it grew. How can a people who said, we will serve the Lord, go from that to sacrificing their sons and daughters to the demons, to burning them with fire? How does that happen? They let them remain. That's the answer. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with the blood. Thus they became unclean in their practices and played the harlot in their deeds. Again, the thing about bad influences is over time, they grow. They start with a little compromise here, a little compromise there. In 1 or 2 generations, what you have is full-blown idolatry. So the question for us this morning, as we try to make a modern-day application to this, apply it to our lives. How well are we doing in preventing bad influences in our lives? Mom, dad, with sons and daughters, how well are you doing preventing bad influences infiltrating your children? How well are we doing in eliminating bad influences from our lives? I don't know what bad influences you all might be fighting on a weekly basis. They're probably a little bit different than mine, but overall, especially as us with children still in our home, our battles are probably very similar. I don't know what battles you might be fighting this morning. Let me give you a couple of mine. Let's talk about television for a minute. Probably can't read that. According to a 2023 study, television shows in 2022 had 5 times more sexual content than television shows in 1980. I read another story that went through television shows from the 60s to the early 2000s. Sexual content in television shows of the 60s was nearly non-existent. Right? That's mom's generation. Not to date anybody here. By my generation, the 90s, it had risen to 60%. 60% in 1998. By 2005, it reached 77%. 77% of TV shows in 2005, that was 20 years ago, had sexual content. That number's exploded now because of all the streaming services. I'm not sure you could, now VidAngel here has put this study out. I'm not sure you could quantify it anymore. How well are we doing in preventing bad influences through TV, media, whatever, on reaching our children? See the growth pattern here. It's escalating, just like it did in the Promised Land. What's the point? It's just a show. It's just a movie. It was just 26 cities. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. According to a RAND Corporation study, adolescents who watch large amounts of television containing sexual content are twice as likely to begin engaging in sexual intercourse in the following year. The battle is real. And it has consequences. Bad influences grow. They grow over time. How well are we doing defending them? Here's another one. Let's talk about modesty for a minute. This one strikes near and dear to my heart because Judy and I have discovered, since our eldest has turned 6 years old, not 16, how impossible it is to find clothes that are modest for a 6-year-old. It's nearly impossible. Here's a picture that I snagged from Target. Now, this picture may not bother you, and guys, this is not a lesson on modesty. We can talk about that at a different time. This is a 6-year-old. This is a size 6 for a 6-year-old. I don't know about you, but that hemline looks about 3 inches too short. Again, this is not a lesson on modesty. But here's my point. If I stick her in this at 6 years old, what does that look like in 6 years when the hemline's getting even shorter? If she gets comfortable in this at 6 years old, what is she going to be comfortable in at 12 years old? At 18 years old? I'm not going to show the fashion for teens. Now, I don't need to. You all see it every day. My point is, over time, it grows. What are the implications 6, 10 years down the road? If she gets comfortable, if I put her in this, she gets comfortable, what are the implications a generation from now when she's raising a daughter? Again, this is not a lesson on modesty. But look at the promised land. It starts with a little compromise here, a little hemline too short here, a little TV show here and there, and over time it grows. Over time it grows. How well are we looking into the future? How well are we doing defending against bad influences right now? Our 6-year-old daughters are being sexualized right in front of our eyes. Look at how teens dress nowadays. Are you serious? You can't walk through the airport. You can't walk through a high school anymore without seeing half navels and skirts even higher than this. This is where it starts. For the children of Israel, it started with 26 cities. That was it. How well are we doing in defense? How well are we playing defense? On the end of the lesson, with a quick reminder, we are to be different. Just like the children of Israel. We're supposed to be different. And I realize how difficult that is when you're a teenager and you're in that realm. But we are supposed to be different. We are supposed to be called out. We are supposed to be a peculiar people, an example of holiness before our peers, an example of what the benefits are of righteous living before our peers, for the people we come in contact with. The point is, we are fighting the same evils that they were fighting in the Promised Land. Look at all the sins of a sexual nature that they were up against and that they left intact. We're fighting the same battles. You know what the worst part about the Promised Land was? You build up and you build up and you build up and you lead up to it in the first 6 books of the Bible, and you anticipate and you say, I can't wait till they get there. It's going to be great. It's going to be a land flowing with milk and honey. And then they get there. And it didn't do them any good. It didn't do them a lick of good. It all went sideways because they let bad influences remain in their lives. What bad influences are we letting infiltrating our lives and our children's lives? That's how they failed in the Promised Land. They didn't kick it out. They didn't get rid of it.